Welcome to Health Creators, where we discuss new creations in healthcare and building the future of health innovation. This is Liv. I'm a health tech founder in the clinical trial space, and I'm joined here today by Steve Roest, founder and CEO of PocDoc, enabling early at-home detection of heart disease, stroke, and other life-threatening conditions. So, Steve, did this start because of the pandemic or before?
No, this was before. So there's always been a huge problem with cardiovascular disease. And other things which are called preventable diseases, so things that like type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease, chronic kidney disease, general ill health that can be prevented. And one of the sort of our theses was that one of the things that's preventing people taking more control over their health is access to testing. So right now, 99.9% of all tests go through the pathology lab system, which is slow, requires a really high sample volume, is expensive, and it just doesn't really align with the way that people are living their lives. It doesn't even align with the direction of travel for the general healthcare system, which is more digital, more personal. So that's why we built PocDoc, which is the world's first smartphone-based blood test.
So it's smartphone-based?
Yeah, app-based.
App-based. So you order PocDoc and you get basically a test, right? And then it links to an app on your phone, basically.
Yeah, so it's a lateral flow test. And it's a combination of lateral flow technology that we've innovated on to be able to provide a quantifiable reaction. So normally lateral flow is very much a yes-no platform. So we've innovated on that, and we've combined it with groundbreaking image analysis that sits in our diagnostic cloud, that from an image taken with the smartphone camera within the PocDoc app, we can isolate the reaction, we can isolate all the pixels, and we can quantify that in terms of the actual concentration level for that particular analyte, all within a matter of seconds. And the interesting thing is, because you're able to give a quantified reaction, quantitative result, it opens up a huge amount of downstream value. So, for example, test and treat, follow-on testing, monitoring, all of those things that are really, really valuable when you're trying to kind of help someone, encourage them to change their behavior and live a healthier life. So it's not just a yes-no reaction. The yes, I have COVID, no, I don't, actually opens up that downstream ecosystem, which is what we find very exciting.
So, whereas before, the lateral flows we're used to taking are this kind of yes-no. What you're building is basically, hey, you do this lateral flow. Do I have to prick my finger?
Yeah, so it's a finger prick, but just as a kind of point of comparison, the at-home sample tests that you get, like Thriver and things like that, that's 500 microliters to fill up that pot. We need 20 microliters.
Okay,
so it's kind of like an order of magnitude smaller. It's significantly smaller, so far more usable, far more practical. For people from any age and kind of any background. So yes, you prick your finger, download the app, use the app to answer questions that at the moment is geared around the cardiovascular disease pathway, so that we can combine the results, the answers that you give us with the results from your biological test, and we can provide it back as a sort of risk assessed certificate.
And I think we've talked about this before, but why is cardiovascular disease important to you?
So, it's important. It should be important for all of us because it's the single biggest killer. For me personally, my dad had a huge stroke when he was 43 that was due in large part to undiagnosed cardiovascular disease. So at the time, access to testing was even worse than it is today. General awareness of the situation around cardiovascular disease was even worse than it was today. So I know that the devastating impact that undiagnosed cardiovascular disease can have, because it had a pretty devastating impact on my family. So I think if there's any way in which we can play our part in that, I mean, our sort of mission is really geared around access to testing. That's sort of our philosophy, and we know that it will make a big impact.
And you feel like this access to testing would have changed your dad's life?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that ultimately he didn't know that he had a ticking time bomb. He knew that he wasn't very healthy, but he didn't know the exact situation. He didn't know that he was, for example, in the red/purple banding, for cholesterol levels. He didn't know because he hadn't had tests done, and it just wasn't something that was done regularly or was sort of accessible really, at that time. And so I feel like if he'd have had regular access to testing, he would have had a better idea of his very specific risk factors, and that would have meant that he would have been more likely to make some lifestyle changes in advance of the cardiac event that he had.
And is part of that because you have this company and your co-founders, one of them is your wife,
She
right?
is, yeah.
And is part of this like, hey, I want to build something where now I would never have to create that same situation with my family.
Yeah,
right?
I think I want to be proud of, I want to be able to point to something that we've done and said that it makes a difference. I think that's really important, not just for us, but for lots of people. You know, in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, there's really been a huge upswing in terms of not just creators and not just sort of entrepreneurs, but people that want jobs that make a difference. You know, that like, yes, you can go and be a developer at one of 100 last-minute delivery companies. That's possible, and you'll get paid a really good salary, I'm sure. But it's not really going to make the world a better place, you know? And so that's why I love doing what we're doing. It's because it's actually making a difference. Like, there's a real mission there that has real value. And that's just within cardiovascular disease. But our technology has also been used more widely, for example, with PATH, which is part of the Gates Foundation to help them screen for polio in Pakistan and other rural areas in Tunisia, where there is no access to pathology lab testing. When there is a polio outbreak, they need to deploy rapid tests very, very quickly. But until PocDoc started to collaborate with them, they weren't able to digitize those results or transmit them back to the surveillance authorities in real time, which is what our diagnostic cloud does. So there's huge amounts of application of what we're doing across the world, and it's really inspiring to be part of all of these different projects.
When did you start seeing this kind of like turning point of like all of these partnerships happening? Because I guess like in the beginning, it's really like prying open the doors, right?
Yeah, I think it was, the pandemic had a big impact. I think pre-pandemic, there was definitely interest in what we were doing, but it wasn't quite as acute. It wasn't quite as like, oh my goodness, we need this now. I think after the pandemic, particularly in the UK, cardiovascular disease is back on the agenda for the healthcare authorities and for the government. They've recognised that it is the single biggest killer, and largely speaking, it's preventable. So if you can find people either in primary prevention or in secondary prevention and get them on statins or some other lipid-lowering therapy, it reduces the risk of them having a cardiac event dramatically. And statins are relatively cheap for the health system. But the gating factor is a 5-marker lipid test. So it's all well and good saying that you want to find the 7.6 million people that are undiagnosed with cardiovascular disease in the UK, but you can't get them into existing phlebotomy services because those existing phlebotomy services are so constrained. So that's where those things have sort of conspired together to create a much clearer use case for what we're doing in a much more acute kind of timely manner.
So you can't get access to essentially testing unless you are at risk for something you don't know you have.
So I think the issue is that the system itself is under so much strain across the board, across the board. Bringing people in to test them for their lipid levels, when you've got, for example, many GP surgeries, they only have one morning of phlebotomy a week. So that means they have a phlebotomist working for like a half day, and they have to schedule all of those for everything, for any diagnostic test has to happen within that window, right? And the tests need to be done by lunchtime because the samples need to be sent off and so forth. So a lot of the time that gets occupied with what's like highly acute blood tests.
Got it.
Not necessarily these more general preventative monitoring type tests. And so there isn't really a very easy way in the system to try and unblock that, right? Because if you're sending samples to the pathology lab, you need to have a phlebotomist because it's a venous blood draw. Whereas actually we're saying, well, hold up a second, there's some blood tests that you can use point of care testing technology. And we've combined that point of care testing with effectively replicating the technology backbone of a lab, but in the cloud. So we can deliver it via an app at point of care, but we've still replicated the technology backbone, the auditable, traceable, regulated technology backbone in the lab. That means that we can vertically integrate with healthcare authorities and healthcare providers. So they get the best of both worlds, really.
Yeah, because I guess it's like access to healthcare for everyone is free. If you're dying. I mean, the access is free as far as the NHS is concerned, but it doesn't mean that you can get access to what you need when you need it. So you don't have to pay, but I mean, the company, my wife, she came up with the original idea for the company because her father went to his GP and tried to get a cholesterol test, and the GP said, no, I'm too busy. You seem healthy enough. And so, no. And that happens up and down the country all the time, and so there has to be a better way. And we want to work within existing pathways, which is why we work with the NHS and healthcare providers. We're not trying to disrupt anything. We're just trying to say there's a better way to increase people's access. So the more people you test, the more people you'll find, the more people you can treat. Really simple.